Elizabeth, the question that I'm left with at the end of this, none of this was particularly surprising, but what checks and balances are there on this president, and does he become more powerful as a result of this impeachment hearing?
I think the Republican Senate has set a very dangerous precedent. The idea that, the president can wholesale obstruct congressional oversight, the key role that the Constitution gives to particularly the House of Representatives to conduct oversight on the executive, I think that does indeed set a very dangerous precedent. But there still are checks and balances, particularly through the court system. So I think now the burden is placed very strongly on the shoulders of the judiciary.
Elizabeth, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm going to come back to that thought. Let's bring back in Elizabeth Wydra, who we interrupted while we were listening to the Chief Justice. And I interrupted you. You were just telling me that you thought that the Senate had set a very dangerous precedent here, Elizabeth.
Yes, I think they have set a very dangerous precedent with respect to both not convicting on the first article of impeachment, the president's abuse of power with respect to inviting foreign interference into American elections, but also very substantially with respect to the second article of impeachment that they failed to remove him on, the obstruction of Congress, because the Constitution requires and expects Congress to conduct oversight of the executive. And here, the Congress has done nothing, I should say the Senate Republicans have done nothing to prevent a president like President Trump from just refusing to comply with oversight subpoenas. And so now it's ironic that you cut to go to the chief, because all eyes now look to the courts to find some way to put the rule of law back in its rightful place, to say that this president must comply with constitutional requirements. And so Chief Justice Roberts was able to get away with basically doing nothing during the impeachment trial. But now, because the Senate Republicans did nothing in the face of President Trump's wholesale obstruction of Congress and justice, the courts are going to have to be the ones to enforce that congressional oversight. And simply because we saw here injustice masquerading as justice, the judiciary is really going to be the place where we will see whether or not the Constitution and its checks and balances will be vindicated. It was the only choice they had to, if they wanted to vindicate their constitutional duty, to impeach this president. And I don't think anyone is going to view this as a total exoneration that the Trump campaign apparently is portraying it as. The only bipartisan act today was the vote to convict the president on the first article of impeachment, the abuse of power. I think people are going to see this as the political statement it is of Republicans, most Republicans in the Senate, banding together to support President Trump. But this isn't by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't think most Americans who supported there being witnesses and documents in the Senate impeachment trial will view this as any sort of legal exoneration. It really is just the Republicans betting and putting all their chips in with Donald Trump, and with the exception of Mitt Romney standing up for his oath before God to give impartial justice and step into his constitutional role as a juror. I think there's going to be a lot of disappointment in this vote today, and certainly I think it will go down in history. And those senators really made a decision. And then, frankly, it is now in the American people's hands. We've seen injustices in the past. We've seen rigged trials in the past. Reverend Barber wrote this great piece about Mitch McConnell bringing so-called Southern justice to the Senate. And the way that people eventually were brought to justice were because we, the people, and movements of people demanded it. And I think, ironically, in that sense, one of the people who brought to justice people who were so-called acquitted under Southern justice were Ku Klux Klan members who were guilty of participating in a bombing that killed African-American children. The person who brought those people to justice was Senator Doug Jones of Alabama. So the arc of the moral universe does bend toward justice, and I think what we've seen today is that we, the people, are going to have to be the ones to bend that arc, and we can't look to our elected leaders, at least today, to do that for us.